Welcome to Firearms Friday here at the Wyoming State Museum in Cheyenne. My name's Evan Green. I'm a volunteer at the museum, and since late fall of 2018, I've been assisting the staff with updating the inventory of the firearms in the museum's permanent collection. And as we encounter firearms with a Wyoming history or that are unique in some way, we'll share those with you in these Firearms Friday videos. So today we're going to talk about a couple of rifles that in some ways are similar yet quite different. This is a really handsome rifle. It has the characteristics that were developed in Pennsylvania, the famous Pennsylvania long rifle. Very graceful, very graceful stock, curved butt plate, relatively long barrel, and full stocked to the end of the barrel. So this one, we don't know very much about the firearm itself. We can assume that since it is a percussion firearm, it was manufactured somewhere after 1830, and because we know something about the original owner, it was probably manufactured before 1860. So you've got a 30-year window there. Often with firearms, we'll know a great deal about the firearm and not very much about the owner. It's really neat when we can find out things about the owner. But a lot of firearms have a manufacturer stamp, a caliber stamp, a serial number, which allows us to approximate the date of manufacture. This one has none of that. But fortunately, we know a great deal about the owner, who had a 55-year history in Wyoming, part of that here in Cheyenne. So this is a fairly typical rifle that was in use in that era, 1830 to 1860, in the eastern part of the United States, where the white-tailed deer were relatively small, and you might encounter a black bear, but a lot of your hunting involved small game. This is a 36 caliber, and again, percussion ignition system. So then we're going to look at this one. This is also a percussion rifle. This one weighs about 8 pounds, which is just a little bit heavier than modern sporting hunting rifles. This one weighs almost 15 pounds. And there's a reason for that, and we'll talk a little bit about the transition and the evolution from firearms that were appropriate to the eastern wooded areas and what had to be changed to accommodate needs as the frontier moved westward. Again, perfectly adequate for small game and white-tailed deer, but as travelers, explorers, settlers moved on to the plains, they encountered a very different wildlife population. Bull buffalo can weigh over a ton, stand 6 foot tall at the shoulder, and you wouldn't want to annoy him by shooting him with a small caliber rifle. This is 54 caliber, again weighs almost 15 pounds, still percussion, ignition system. And the reason for this really heavy barrel is given metallurgy of the day, the way to make it strong was to make it really big. So it would contain the 100, 120, 150 grains of black powder needed to propel a 54 caliber projectile at your big game, your grizzly bear, your buffalo, your elk, or certainly human adversaries. So it's pretty obvious that you weren't going to go trotting around the prairies with this thing over your shoulder, or maybe you would if you weren't out long, but more likely it was intended to be carried on horseback because the horse became a really valuable asset as you were working in the wide open spaces of the American West. So, okay, we don't know, again, much about the owner of this one. There's a name roughly inscribed in the top that's either M.B. Pelton or maybe Felton, but I was unable to come up with anything under that name. So the other similarity is they both have set triggers, and a set trigger allows you to sort of preset the sear in the mechanism so that your trigger pull to discharge the weapon is very light, which enhances your accuracy. So again, that's the evolution of rifles from eastern plains to eastern forested areas to the western plains. So let's talk a little bit about the owner of this rifle. We know from information gathered in the accession file when the rifle was donated to the museum in 1967 that the original owner was Samuel Gordon Plummer. In 1862, he was 35 years old, had 5 children, married with 5 children, and was farming in Illinois. On September 1st of 1862, he was mustered into the 84th Illinois Volunteer Regiment at the time that regiment was mustered into federal control. So again, he went in as a first sergeant, which indicates that his superior officers and the privates had a great deal of faith in Mr. Plummer. Unfortunately, the 84th Illinois Volunteer Infantry was involved in the Stones River battle in central Tennessee, which occurred December 31st and January 1st. December 31st of 1862 and lapsed over into January 1st. And Mr. Plummer was killed on December 31st of 1862. And this rifle was passed down to his grandson, Charles Preston Plummer. And he's the one with a 55-year history in Wyoming. So we knew originally that he graduated from law school at the University of Illinois in 1906. And then there was this gap in our information until we found his performance or his record in World War I. He was captain of an ammunition train supporting an artillery brigade. He served 15 months in France and returned from the war and opened his own law practice in Casper. The 1920 census shows him in Casper. By this time, he's married to Evelyn, and he's in his time in Casper, he established an American Legion post and eventually became a vice national commander of the American Legion. So, well-regarded person. By 1930, he's moved his law practice to the Hines Building here in Cheyenne, and he and Evelyn are living in a modest little brick house in the 100 block of East Pershing. I drive by it every day coming to the museum. So, 1838, he was a regional manager for the National Wildlife Federation, and he and Evelyn jointly endowed a scholarship to the University of Wyoming, which is still being awarded to students doing cross-disciplinary work in natural resources. So, okay, we've got this gap from 1906 to World War I, and we just happened on the transcript of a trial. And I'm going to get my notes here, because this is an interesting story, I think, and I think you'll like it. So this is a trial before the Appellate Division of the Supreme Court of New York, December 3rd and 4th, 1914. So the summary and backstory is that a guy named Max Pam from New York owned and controlled all stocks and bonds of the North Laramie Land Company. In 1911, he engaged the firm of Thompson Sterrett Company from Salt Lake to construct certain improvements to that North Laramie irrigation project. The works were near Wheatland, Wyoming. This court case is an attempt by Mr. Pam to recover some of his costs, which he alleges were fraudulently billed to the project. So anyway, fraudulent vouchers submitted by Harry Jennings and J.H. Meredith. Over the course of the project, Pam was billed 3 times the initial estimate of the project, and we think we know where that money went because the record shows that Jennings maintained a stock of fine wine, imported cigars, he bought a car, and charged it to the project. Meredith bought jewelry for his wife, carried dead men on the payroll as a means to divert funds to himself. So, what's that got to do with our friend Charles Preston Plummer? Well, we discovered through the testimony that Charles Preston Plummer, in fact, came to Wyoming in 1911, and was a part-time attorney for the Burlington, Colorado and Southern Railroad. And he came to Wyoming at the recommendation of friends he knew in Illinois who worked for the railroad there. So, again, the transcript of the trial is quite interesting. It reads like a novel. Jennings was the guy hired by this Thompson Sterrett Company to be in charge of these irrigation construction project. So here's a quote from the transcript of the trial. Jennings' most recent occupation had been that of a bawdy house keeper, and Morton placed him in charge of the works. Meredith had been unemployed for over a year. His last job was as a saloon keeper in Alaska. Neither of these guys had any engineering or irrigation experience, but they sure knew how to live high on the hog. When, after the fiasco with the North Laramie Land Company, Meredith was apprehended on the run with another man's wife, and he had over $12,000 in cash and gold. He was, in fact, in prison at the time of the trial in 1914. So what does that tell us about our friend Charles Preston Plummer, who from our earlier information comes off as a solid citizen, lawyer with a good reputation? So we're going to talk a little bit about his testimony. He was called to testify at the trial because he was in Wheatland, Wyoming, knew Jennings, knew Meredith, rode his horse out to see the works under construction. And his testimony discusses Jennings' lavish lifestyle and an overpayment by Meredith. Meredith was the cashier of the project, so he was in charge of the money. And Plummer took a bill to Meredith for $10 for legal work that he'd done for the project. And Meredith says, oh, here's another $5. Here's $10, here's another $5. Don't worry about it, I got plenty of money. So here's the testimony by Plummer. And at one point, Plummer was accused by Jennings, the bawdy house manager, of gossip, that Jennings had, quote, kept a girl at the construction camp. Well, given his background, that wouldn't be surprising. So at one point, Jennings confronted Plummer about the gossip. And here's Plummer's statement in the transcript. I told him I didn't think enough of him to either talk to him or about him. And I told him he was a big son of a bitch, and if he ever tied into me in that way again, he would get a whipping he would remember for a long time. You don't need to put that in the record, but I can do it, and he knew it too. So there's another side of Charles Preston Plummer. So if you have other information or want to chat with us about firearms, give the museum a call and we'll arrange to get together. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it.